In this video, I'm going to share 10 different times that I messed up as an actor. And one of those times might have cost me a recurring role on a television show. I hope that my transparency will help you feel okay about your own goofs, and we can all learn from my mistakes. Everyone, I'm Matthew Cornwell with Get Taped, which I co-own with my amazingly talented, beautiful wife and best friend, Brooke. She's not here this week. Okay, let's just jump right in. This first example was from one of my very first bookings in my career, so over 23 years ago. It was for an industrial, which, if you don't know what that is, those are just training videos for corporations. And it was a teleprompter job. They sent me the script a couple days before, and so I was going to be a good actor and memorize all of my dialogue. So then I get to set, and I'm sitting across from my boss. Shout out to Mark Oliver. I'm engaging with him because they had a teleprompter off to his left shoulder, but I didn't want to look at that. I wanted to prove how prepared I was, and also I wanted to engage with Mark, so I'm looking him in the eye, and I'm really getting into this role. And after the first take or so, I hear the teleprompter operator whisper to the director, "He's not reading the prompter." I didn't realize they'd changed the script from the one they had sent me. And it was a huge lesson when it came to teleprompter jobs. Do not memorize the script. They're going to change it. That's part of the reason why they made this a teleprompter job. They want that flexibility to change wording on the fly and to not think about how you might be affected as the actor with having to memorize something new. You're just going to read it off the prompter. Should be simple. And that's the other thing you have to understand about teleprompter jobs. You need to be good at reading on the fly and not making it look like you're reading off a prompter. That is not a trivial skill, and you need to hone it and don't lie about it on your resume. Okay, this next example was for my very first film audition for the movie Bobby Jones, Stroke of Genius. I was auditioning for Chum, who had 6 words. Yeah. And I had been in acting class for a while where we had really been working on the concept of colors, incorporating multiple levels into your performance, different emotional content, beats, etc. And so I was determined to cram 3 emotions into my 6 words of dialogue. Yeah. Somehow, by the grace of God, I got a callback because whatever I did in that first audition had to have been laughable, because at the callback, I did the exact same thing in front of the director and the producer, and they pretty much laughed at me and gave me a second chance and said, okay, let's do it again and just say the line. "There's no way prohibition can last." See how simple that was? And I booked it, thankfully, but it was a big lesson on trying to cram your entire training, your entire resume into one line of dialogue. That is not your job in that moment. No, your job is just to be natural, be authentic, fit into the world that has been created. All of these examples and all these lessons, we have videos that sort of expound upon these concepts that you can find on our channel. But for now, let's just move on to the next example. Okay, we're going to flash forward to the early 2010s for an audition for Sleepy Hollow, the television show, and it was for a nice size role early in the first season. On this particular day, I was trying to cram my prep into a very small amount of time because we had a full day of taping, and I wanted to get my audition out of the way before all of those actors and before the deadline. And so I was really plagued by the second scene because I'm talking to this character for the bulk of the scene, and then that conversation ends, and suddenly a mysterious figure is sitting there in my apartment. But the first character doesn't respond or even notice that character. And it just felt like bad writing. So, I did my best with it, whatever, and submitted my audition. Lo and behold, an actor comes in a couple hours later for that role, and I'm reading with them. And we get to the second scene, and as I hit record, they hold their phone up to their ear. It was a phone call. That's why the first character doesn't respond to the second character, because they were on the phone. Oh my gosh, how did I make such a rookie mistake? Well, I didn't do my script analysis. And in that short amount of time that I gave myself to prepare for this role, I should have spent more time doing script analysis than whatever I was doing, probably trying to memorize my lines. So it was a huge lesson in what you should not neglect when it comes to a self-tape, namely script analysis. Oh, and let us know in the comments below if you'd be interested in a script analysis class of sorts. It might take the form of a pre-recorded follow-along class or something that's more interactive like a Zoom call where on a weekly basis you would join and get to ask questions and talk about either an actual script you're working on or maybe something that you bring to class or that I share with you in the class. Just give us a comment below if you're interested. Okay, this next lesson that I learned the hard way is in time management and planning when you are headed to set. So this was for a Netflix show, and I was going to have a couple days on set. My first day, I was driving out to location. It was here in Atlanta, and I was smart enough to contact the Basecamp PA ahead of time and say, "Hey, where do I park?" And they said, "Oh, park at base. There will be space for you there." Well, I get to base camp a few minutes early. So I would have been right there on time by the time I parked and got to my trailer. But the security guard, who was all of maybe 19 years old, hiking his pants up as he runs up to my car, says, can't park here. And so I just listened to him, drove to crew parking, which was over a mile away. Then I had to wait for a van to gather all of the extras and me, take me back to set. Meanwhile, the second AD and the Basecamp PA are texting me, wondering where I am because now I'm late. And so I walk into my trailer furious because of the fact that this security guard messed up my morning. And if I had just allotted more time to get to set, then I would have been able to pivot or have figured out the parking situation and would have had a nice day on set instead of the morning that I had that I then sort of took out on the first PA who walked me to set. And she's asking me, "So how's your day?" And I said, "Well, it's a crap show." Pretty sure I didn't use the word crap though. Okay, for this next example, let me back up to somewhere around 2010 on the movie The Change Up with Jason Bateman and Ryan Reynolds. And the fact that these photos are on the screen is the lesson. Asking for selfies. See, I was early in my career and still hadn't learned this lesson. I was there with Bateman, next to him in the cash chair, and just felt sort of natural to ask for that selfie. And he was so courteous and offered to take it with me. Same thing with Ryan Reynolds. But what I didn't think about was, first of all, the logistical nightmare that could have happened because all the extras that were there that day see me doing that and now think it's okay for them to ask for selfies if they can get close enough to the stars. That's a door you don't want to open. So if you're going to ask for a selfie, do not do it in full view of extras or other people on set. That's just poor form, and that's all on me. The second lesson, though, is that by asking for a selfie with that number 1 and 2 on the call sheet, you're sort of implying that you don't think you belong there. This is a vacation for you. You're in front of the Eiffel Tower and you want to get a photo. Makes sense on vacation because you don't live there and this is a vacation and you want to remember it. But if you're an actor and you're trying to build a career through speaking roles that start to grow over time and you go from day player to weekly performer to eventually you're negotiating high rates and you're number 1 on a call sheet, if that is your goal as an actor, then you need to start acting like you belong there when you're on set. And so asking for selfies with the celebrities, again, is telling them, it's telling yourself, it's telling Instagram when you post it that, hey, look at this thing that is an accident and I didn't expect it to happen. See how awesome it was that I accidentally was in the same physical vicinity as Jason Bateman and Ryan Reynolds. And look, I know that can sound harsh to some of you, but I just want you to start thinking in terms of, I belong here when you book something. And when you do have that mindset, it changes the narrative in your brain as to whether or not you need to take a selfie with that celebrity. Okay, let's go back to my very first audition ever after I got my agent. It was weirdly for an extra, which normally you don't have to audition to be an extra, but this was to be a football player in a national commercial. And so they wanted people physically in the room so that they could just see whether or not you look like a football player and they could quickly ask you, do you have football experience? And side note, the casting director was Melissa McBride of Walking Dead fame. Yeah, she used to be a casting director here in Atlanta. Anyways, so I go in there and the first thing she asks me is, do you have a headshot? And I said, oh, my agent should have sent you one. And she said, yeah, you still need to bring one with you. Oh, So I was pretending to know something about my career that clearly I didn't know. Now, this note is largely obsolete now because you don't have to have physical headshots anymore. And even if they do ask for a headshot, they'll completely understand if you don't have any printed anymore and you bring in some sort of crappy one that you printed on a home printer or went to the local pharmacy and had it printed out there. But the lesson was that I was acting like I knew what I was doing when I clearly had no idea what I was doing. So that whole fake it till you make it, be careful about that when you're in the presence of a casting director or a director, etc. Okay, this next example happened much more recently compared to those other examples, and it was for some sort of federal official who is walking into a bank to basically shut down the bank. I might have been with the SEC or the FBI, one of those acronyms. And the dialogue was confident, forceful, aggressive, and full of jargon. And it was in person with a casting director who already scares me, even to this day. And so I stumbled partway through the first take. She was gracious and said, "Oh, it's okay. We'll take it again." I stumbled again. She was still gracious. On the third take, she messed up. And so she's like, "See, even I mess up." She was actually really doing a good job of trying to make me feel at ease. Fourth take, I still stumbled. Finally, I did what I should have done to begin with. I took a breath. I kind of calmed myself. And then I did it without any sort of issue. But the lesson that I learned was I had this opportunity with a casting director who rarely calls me in because she is super specific about who she calls in. When you get an audition with this casting office, there are maybe 5 other actors that you're up against. It's like you're already at the callback. And I knew this going into the audition, and I just didn't prepare. I audition for these types of roles all the time, where it's not so much about acting, it's about having a handle on that type of jargon, on that type of dialogue, because you have to walk in with that confidence, owning the space. You can't stumble, you can't improvise, you can't your way to the next line. You gotta do it, and you gotta nail it on that first try. And I just didn't do the proper prep to make sure that I was ready for that audition. And so that was a shame on me for phoning it in or just compromising my own prep when I fully knew what I was walking into. Speaking of scary casting directors, earlier in my career, this would have been somewhere in the early 2000s, I walked into an in-person audition with another scary casting director. Certainly in my early 20s, she came across very scary. And I had been taught in my class, which I had been now in class for a couple of years, was feeling much more confident about my craft. And I had been sort of taught that old school mentality of bring your sides into the audition, partly so that if they change something like, "Hey, Matthew, on page 2, I'm not going to say that line, or we're going to skip to that third page. We're not even going to do that second page." You want to have your sides in case they change things up. But also it's to remind the decision makers that this is not a finished performance. This is a work in progress. I'm willing to collaborate and to adjust, etc. So I walk in thinking that sort of mentality, holding my sides. I'm also not 1,000% off book at this point, especially with the nerves of being in front of this important casting director. And of course, the very first thing she says to me is, "You don't need your sides, do you?" And of course, my heart sinks. I get a frog in my throat. I'm like, no. And I set them down, sort of staring at them one last time, hoping that I won't forget a line. And so it was a lesson, again, in preparation. I sort of walked in with this hubris of what my teacher had told me is the way things work, not thinking that each casting director has their own way of running things and that I need to be ready to pivot and adjust. And I just wasn't ready to pivot and adjust. I wasn't prepared enough to make that transition. Sure enough, I did not book that role. Okay, this next example is from a booking on a low-budget independent film set, and it's a lesson in speaking up for yourself. It was a horror movie. We were up in North Georgia, staying the night nearby the set. It was paid, but it was low budget. It was a World War II vampire zombie werewolf. I don't know. I can't remember. It never got finished for reasons I won't disclose. But in this one particular scene, a werewolf is jumping off this balcony. So they did that stunt separately. But when they land on the ground, there's a firing squad of soldiers waiting to kill the werewolf. Well, the genius director, Ron, I am going to call out his first name at least, decided to stagger the three of us soldiers for camera, maybe, so that it looked better on camera instead of being just side by side. We were using like vintage rifles from that era. But what I came to find out after the fact was the blanks that he had bought for these rifles were not the right caliber for these guns. Suffice to say, the result is there was a louder sound when you fired the rifle. Well, based on where I was positioned, my ear was right next to the muzzle of one of those rifles. So sure enough, take one, we fired those rifles, and man, I felt like my eardrum had been shattered. And I just threw his vintage musket on the ground and said, "That's it, I'm done." I didn't quit the whole movie, but that was the only take that I was willing to do. And I spoke up for myself, but too late. I felt uneasy much before that, based on other things that were happening on the set, but specifically as we started to set up that scene. And I should have spoke up for myself, especially because it involved firearms. And he did not have a firearms safety person there. It was just sort of one of those, hey, they're blanks. Just, do it. And that can happen a lot on indie film sets when it comes to stunts, when it comes to explosives like that, firearm safety, when it comes to intimacy and nudity. So you just have to keep an eye out, realize that you are your biggest advocate. And if it's a low enough budget set, or if it's non-union where there's no intimacy coordinator, you're the only one who's going to be looking out for your own best interests. So you must speak up for yourself and don't feel like you are somehow compromising the production. This is their fault if they do not make you feel safe on set, and you should feel okay calling them out for that. Okay, so I think we're at the 10th example, and this is the one that I alluded to in the opening. This was an actual booking that I had for a television show. This was back in 2010. My audition was the first audition I had back from my honeymoon, where I just didn't care. And so I was throwing lines into the audition that weren't there, showing my comedic skills. Turns out the showrunners loved my improv. I was at the table read for the pilot, and they were saying, we just loved it. We're going to try to incorporate it. Great. And I was a cop, and this was a show called The Gates. It was a summer replacement for Desperate Housewives on ABC. It was a vampire werewolf show. Gosh, there seems to be a theme. And I was told at the time of the deal memo that I was going to be in 3 out of the first 6 episodes. And they hadn't really solidified the back half of the season. There was going to be 13 episodes. So I would likely be in more in the back half of the season. So the first episode goes great. And my scenes were opposite Frank Grillo, who was the number 1 on the call sheet. Flash forward to I think it was the 6th episode. They had written me out of one of the other episodes. They referenced me, but I just wasn't in it. So my 3 episodes had already gone down to 2. And on that second episode, I felt welcomed by the showrunner and by a lot of the crew. But I started to get the sense that Frank maybe didn't really care for my style, my sense of humor, my approach to the character of Eddie. So while I was making the showrunner and everyone else feel at ease with who I was and making them laugh at some of the choices I was making, I just got this sense that he thought I was some sort of local yokel and like, who is this guy? Who hired this guy? And so this is purely in my head. I have no evidence to support this, but the fact that I was not called back for the second half of the season and I was removed from that 3rd or 4th episode, so my 3 episodes went to 2 and then nothing after that, it felt reasonable to assume that I did not make the best impression with the number 1 on the call sheet, and he made that known to the writers, the showrunner, producers, studio, network, etc. And I just didn't come back. Now, that's what my ego tells me. An equally likely scenario is that the comedy that I was bringing that was welcomed in that pilot episode just wasn't fitting the tone of the show. If you were to go back and watch that season, it got dark kind of quickly. And so having that levity to the extent that I was bringing it, maybe just didn't make sense anymore. And so they realized that, now that we know what our show is, Eddie just doesn't fit into it. But ultimately, it was a lesson in reading the room and knowing how you fit into the puzzle, into that tapestry once you do arrive on set. From the moment you get to base camp, into the makeup trailer, the costume fitting that you had maybe a couple days before, you will start to glean what is the tone of this set of this show, and you can start to make adjustments. So if you did 2 or 3 takes in your audition and you're just wondering which one they wanted or they're going to expect you to do once you get the set, you can make a lot of those decisions just by feeling the tone, by reading the room, so that by the time you actually are in that rehearsal for that first take, you figured it out. I unfortunately was riding that high of being married to Brooke and booking this recurring job, and they love my improv. And so I just sort of mistakenly thought that my purpose on the set was something different. I had inflated my sense of importance to this story and was probably trying to take up more space than I deserved to. And so whether or not it was Frank or just the natural progression of things that had me written out of that show, it was still a lesson in reading the room and understanding what your purpose is in serving the story. Okay, so those are my 10 examples. And as a corollary, there's 1,000 other times on set that I should have spoken up for myself because I was being asked to do things that quite honestly are not in the job description of an actor. And again, I have videos about that on this channel as well. But if you have anecdotes of lessons you learned the hard way, please share them in the comments below. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on set.